Sometimes you'll encounter traits that, although they're Mendelian, meaning they're controlled by one gene, dominant, recessive, heterozygous, they don't seem to follow the rules. They don't present necessarily as these Mendelian diseases or Mendelian traits. So there are certain conditions that don't seem to follow the laws. Even though they are following the laws, they don't appear to be. Okay? So the genotypes are working fine, but somehow in the translation, in the phenotype, there's something that is causing it to look different than it is. Okay? Some traits can be altered by the environment. Some can be altered by other genes. And some have just an unusual way of presenting themselves. We're going to use the word lethal here. When we talk about something being lethal, we mean it's deadly. Okay? But in the biological sense, lethal really only applies to whether or not it will kill an organism, an individual, before that individual can reproduce. Okay? It's different from fatal in biology. So in the case of a lethal allele, a lethal disease or a lethal allele will cause the death of the individual before that individual can pass their genes on to someone else. So before the age of maturity, before childbearing years, for example. So to distinguish between those two, Huntington's disease is lethal, but not in the biological sense. So it'll kill everybody who has it, but it doesn't kill until middle age. As a matter of fact, you usually don't start having symptoms until middle age. So that's long after the possibility of having children. So it can be passed on. Okay, but there are diseases like Tay-Sachs disease, for example, that is lethal in that it kills 100% of the people who have it, usually before they're 5 years old. No chance of passing those genes on. And yet it still persists. Usually lethal alleles are homozygous recessive, usually. So most of the things like Tay-Sachs disease, for example, is a homozygous recessive disease. That means that in order to have it, you have to have 2 copies of the broken gene. Some cases there are homozygous dominant combinations that are lethal. In other words, if you have 1 copy of the dominant gene, you may get sick or you may have mild symptoms, but you won't necessarily die. But if you have 2 copies of the dominant gene, then you die. Another possibility is this concept of multiple alleles. Okay? Since we know that a person has 2 alleles for each trait, 2 copies, 1 on each chromosome, 1 on each homolog. Even though you might have a trait that's controlled by 1 gene, sometimes throughout a population, that particular gene can be spelled in a lot of different ways. And since your specific combination of alleles determines what phenotype you have, if there are lots of different ways of spelling the different alleles, your phenotypes are going to vary a little bit as well. They're not going to be simply like, yes, you have this disease, or no, you don't. Perfect example is this disease called phenylketonuria. Phenylketonuria is a disease in which you don't produce an enzyme that is necessary to break down the amino acid called phenylalanine. If phenylalanine builds up in the body, you can't break it down. It starts to build up and often builds up in the brain. There are more than 300 different spellings of the gene that controls phenylketonuria. 300 different versions of the spelling. There are 4 basic phenotypes that you'll find. Classic PKU. The gene is so broken that the enzyme is never formed. The individual builds phenylalanine in their brain before they're even born. And those individuals with classic PKU are born with profound mental retardation. Often they don't live very long. There's moderate PKU where the mental effects are somewhat less than classic PKU, but still there. There's very mild PKU. And there's a version of the disease where instead of breaking down phenylalanine, you don't break it down because you can't if you have PKU. It's just excreted. Excess phenylalanine is excreted in the urine. Those people may never know that they have the disease. Interesting about phenylketonuria that's worthy of mention. You will possibly, you have seen this word before. Phenylketonurics are people who suffer from phenylketonuria. If you drink diet soda, for example, or if you eat anything that contains the artificial sweetener aspartame, marketed under the name NutraSweet, that artificial sweetener contains the amino acid phenylalanine. And when you eat it or drink a soda, diet soda that's sweetened with aspartame, your body breaks it down into its 2 pieces, 3 pieces really, and you process those amino acids and do stuff with them. But if you have phenylketonuria, you want to be very careful eating things with NutraSweet, because you won't be able to break down that phenylalanine. So these are a couple of examples. Now there's another type of situation where, even though we're following Mendel's laws, it may not appear to follow those, called sex-linked or X-linked traits. We'll talk about those in the next video.